I've started a lot of series on this channel. It's actually kind of a problem. I can't seem to find the time to actually expand on many of them to the degree I'd like. Some of them are more successful than others, some experiments just pan out better, but I think in terms of numbers and fan engagement, you guys have been pretty clear with me. You want more Mucore videos. And I am willing to give you more Mucore videos. It's a series that's pretty fun for me to make, and while the listening phase takes a lot longer than some of my other series, as I have to give a full dozen records their due time to really grow on me and give me things to talk about, I'm yet to have a final product in this series that I am not immensely proud of. Disregarding the less than savory 4chan connection this chart obviously has, I think these albums remain to be some of the more discussion-worthy records in recent decades, and as a starting point to broadening your taste in music, I think there's not many better places to start, so long as you make sure to expand beyond this chart and don't let it define you. I'm going to do my best to at least double my output in this series with a whopping 2 whole videos a year. If I can get more out, I will, but if this was the only thing I worked on, I think I would lose my mind, so try to stick around for the other stuff too. In this 4th episode of the series, I'm going to be talking about the 12 albums that make up the C row on the original chart. Of the episodes I've done so far, this is definitely the highest count of albums I had not heard prior to researching this video, so I have a lot of fresh ideas bouncing around that I'm excited to put to words here. Without further ado, let's get noisy. Historically, the first record of the episode has always been a bit of a roadblock for me when making this series, as I alluded to last time with Siamese Dream. In that case, it was that I wasn't sure what there was to actually say, which I then got over by just throwing my hands in the air and writing to see what came out. With Yo La Tengo this episode, though, it was a very different roadblock that kept me from proceeding. I couldn't stop listening to this band. And not just the album for this episode either. I listened to I Can Hear the Heart Beating as One first and loved it, but I was also compelled to go all the way back and listen to the band's entire catalog up to that point, as well as a bit of what came after, to get some fuller context of how a band could get to the point where they release an album like this. What I found was not only an interesting and very engaging band trajectory spanning a whole decade prior, but also one of my new favorite bands. With multiple classics across a now double-digit number of releases I've heard thus far, and still more than 15 records I've yet to hear, it was such a pleasant surprise to be taken so aback by the quality that I needed to dive back further, and to have that effort rewarded so heavily. This episode's album is 1997's I Can Hear the Heart Beating as One, as I mentioned earlier, and it's their 9th studio album. Taking the chaotic noise rock and pop on the preceding Electro Pura and combining it nicely with the gorgeous nocturnal serenity of Painful, Yo La Tengo came out with what is pretty easily the quintessential effort from the band. Every style and aesthetic the group had explored in the decade prior makes an appearance in some form or fashion, be it the jangle pop of their earliest works, the raw noise from early era detours, or the sloppy Velvet Underground-ish guitar drivel that defines the noise pop genre they embody. This is the longest album the band had released to this point, and none of that time is wasted, as every track serves to display a different facet of what makes this band so special. Take the first full-length track on here, Moby Octopad, with its low-mixed buzzing guitar noise and general sound manipulation. For nearly the whole song, the two guitars play no actual notes, instead exploiting distortion, reverb, and the tone and volume knobs on their guitar to create a less all-consuming take on shoegaze noise guitar. The bass line, though, is what makes this one of my favorite songs ever, and possibly my favorite Yo La Tengo song, because for as repetitive as it is, barely changing for the whole 6-minute runtime, it creates this unwavering hypnosis that everything else, the soft layered vocals, the piano solo, the tambourine, rides on perfectly. Within one song, you're completely locked in, and we haven't even gotten to the big single. That single, which, at the time was the biggest but has since been overtaken by a song we'll talk about later, is Sugar Cube. And it's basically just the perfect indie rock song. Soft but urgent vocal delivery, a simple but memorable metaphor in the hook, and a mix that is completely consumed by noise, but not made any less palatable to a wider audience with a taste for something a little off the beaten path, but still needing a good jam. The pop side never interferes with the noise, and the noise is never too overbearing that the pop gets smothered out. It's just amazing. Another song that was released as a single, a cover of the Beach Boys track Little Honda that was originally supposed to be a test of the recording equipment, turned out so good that they just had to keep it, and I can't argue with them because it's one of my favorites on the record, with droning levels of distortion on the guitar chords and such a grand swagger to its delivery of first, second, third gear. This track leads nicely into the instrumental track Green Arrow with its gorgeous slide guitar and incredibly nostalgic summer night mood. For all its simplicity, it is easily one of my favorites on the record and leads me nicely into the variety of sounds on this thing. There's so much, from bossa nova on Center of Gravity and dream pop on Damage to like the 10 minutes of krautrock on Spec Jam and the psychedelic influences throughout the whole record. Smack dab in the middle of the whole thing is the track Autumn Sweater, Yo La Tengo's biggest song, and I cannot argue with its reign in that position. This is one of the most gorgeous tracks of the 90s, feeling like the Night to Bittersweet Symphony's daytime anthem. With much more down-tempo and trip-hop influences, it feels like a fuzzed-out interpretation of Gustavo Cerati's Bocanada, perhaps. The subdued vocals work here better than anywhere else on the record, so quiet, but also so impossible to ignore. No band makes a tone piece quite like Yo La Tengo, and I think this has got to be one of their best. There is one track that outdoes everything else on this record though, and that's the penultimate We're an American Band, which grows and swells with droned and kill-switched guitars, smooth walking bass chords, and a lush drumline full of subtle fills and a long drawn-out crash sound. What pushes this track well above and beyond for me though is the guitar solo. This has been in my top 5 guitar solos for years and years and hasn't shown any signs of budging yet. I love the way it starts as this pretty traditional single melody that gradually gets too big for its own good and collapses into this noise jam that keeps grasping for that sense of melody it had earlier, but just can't quite get a hold on it. The instruments trying and failing to keep their head above water, but repeatedly being sucked under the rapids of feedback and distortion. In making this video, Yo La Tengo very quickly became one of my favorite bands ever, and while this isn't quite my favorite from them, it's definitely top 3, and if you're looking for a starting place in their pretty massive discography, I don't think there's a better introduction than this one. Enjoy.
Now I'm crazy for you, but not that crazy.
A few times in this series I have brought up, perhaps in a show of cowardice, worrying about an album before writing about it. So often, it can feel like a Herculean task to discuss albums of a certain density or cultural significance. In retrospect, it feels like a pretty weak way to introduce most of the albums, and I feel as though I could have done a better job giving an individual pitch for them. With the Magnetic Fields' 1999 album 69 Love Songs, though, this sense of intimidation and unapproachability is a core element of the album's artistic identity. Throughout history, bands have played with the number of songs in the title gag to subvert expectations, whether that be Throbbing Gristle, Ween, or any number of others. At first glance of this album, you might anticipate something similar, that or a whole album about 69ing. But upon closer inspection, likely to your horror or bemusement, you will find that the title is no farce. 69 songs, back-to-back, across 3 discs, 2.5 hours of music which, if the title is to be believed, and it hasn't lied to us yet, are all about love. You can probably see where my worries come from then. I've tackled dense albums, long albums, all of that, but to pick up this absolute monster of a 3 CD and declare, I am going to review this album, feels like a joke in and of itself. It's the single album I have dreaded the most since starting this series 2 years ago. Something happened since then, though, that has put my mind at ease, and I actually feel excited and invigorated to talk about this massive undertaking of a record, and it's a pretty simple thing. I listened to the album. 69 Love Songs is scary and overwhelming in its concept and scale, but as soon as you start listening to it for the first time, all of that trepidation falls away in light of just how easy this record is to actually listen to. Sure, the runtime is still going to be a factor no matter what. You can only set that much time aside so many times in your life, but 2.5 hours is made to feel like mere minutes when listening to this album thanks to genius pacing, variety, and a dedication to thematic cohesion that is borderline unfathomable. Love is pretty much inarguably the most written about subject in music history. Songs that you don't think are about love are about love. Songs that you think are about love are actually even more about love than you thought. Art and love are nearly inextricable, and music is one of the most accessible outlets for that. What sets the magnetic fields apart on this album is the sheer breadth and detail with which they explore that core theme. There's so many infinite ways to love, to be loved, so many that even across 69 different songs, they could never come close to touching on all of them. But by God did they try, and largely I think they succeed at every turn. Heartbroken love, selfish love, disappointing love, horny love, unrequited love, love you wish was unrequited, gay love, straight love, platonic love, masculine and feminine, toxic and healthy, and every shade in between. It's a level of inclusivity to all experiences that could only ever have been achieved through this quantity of music, and frankly, the fact that they were able to cram it into a package of even this size is a massive accomplishment in my eyes. There's a level of specificity that keeps 69 Love Songs engaging from front to back for me. Every song feels like its own little world with characters, plot lines, and history that we only get a tiny glimpse of. Sure, these songs are all love songs in abstract, but you don't write a love song without a subject of that love, and each of these dozens of songs paint beautiful, ugly, and complex portraits of each of these situations and people. With this variety of different loves comes an equal or greater variety of musical genres to accompany them. This isn't like 100 Gex or Mr. Bungle levels of wacky variety. It's not the insanity you might imagine when I say that every song is a different genre, but every song fills a different musical niche nonetheless. Almost any instrument you could imagine shows up on this thing, from more regular pop fare like guitars, violins, and the like, to more specific use instruments like accordion, glockenspiel, tambourine, harp, and so many more. Each of the track's instrumentation is so completely unique to it, and it helps to keep the pace for the majority of its runtime. And let's talk for a minute about the pace, because with a project of this scope, that was always going to be the biggest issue. And while I would be lying if I said it was completely perfect, it is still nothing short of miraculous how tolerable they managed to make this runtime. As I do with most albums intentionally split into multiple discs, I treat each disc as its own album when I listen to it. With this in mind, the mostly straightforward first disc would be an easy 10 out of 10 if it were released alone. I mentioned years ago that Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys had just about the best composition of any pop album I had ever heard, with its amazing harmonies and instrumental beauty, and I hold to that, but had the first disc of 69 Love Songs been released alone, then the Beach Boys might have had some steep competition. Be it the brief but universally relatable Absolutely Cuckoo, the country twang of All My Little Words, or I Think I Need a New Heart, which, if it's not the best song on the album, it's up there thanks to that absolutely infectious chorus melody. By disc 2, we're ready to get a bit more experimental with some of the synthier stuff akin to their previous two records, and while the consistency is a little lessened here, the tracks here are pretty unanimously more interesting and out there. By this point in the album, we've gotten pretty damn experimental, and while relative to most stuff I talk about on this channel, that level of experimentation is still tame, relative to where we started, it's like Shoo Shoo was in the studio. Even still, there's nice and accessible tracks like Acoustic Guitar and The Death of Ferdinand de Saussure that keep variety constantly. The album doesn't close particularly strongly or conclusively, which is what you would expect with this record, which is far more compilation than album, but at the end of it, I am still inevitably left impressed by the fact that I've made it through without getting bored, and the fact that they stayed on topic unfalteringly for this long. This thing is truly a feat and an achievement, and while I've definitely heard better from the Magnetic Fields, they're my partner's favorite band, so I've heard a good amount of their best material, it's not without good reason that this is what the band is known for. They would never attempt something like this again, and thank God for that, because as it stands, this remains a historic moment in long album history. We haven't talked about post-hardcore in this series since Slint, if I'm remembering correctly, and while next episode will have a ton of it, for now, let's talk about one of, if not the most essential records in the genre, Fugazi's Repeater. Fugazi is, according to fellow music YouTuber and absolute GOAT Deep Cuts, the best band of all time, and there is very little I can do to argue with that. Post-hardcore existed before, of course, thanks to bands like Minutemen, Mission of Burma, and Husker Du, but if you had to distill the movement down to a single band, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a better, more quintessential band than Fugazi. Across 7 albums and 3 EPs, the band defined the DIY punk aesthetic that so many bands in and outside of the genre would use as a template going forward. Ian MacKaye, who had already made himself the face of straight-edge hardcore with Minor Threat, was insistent that with Fugazi, all shows would be $5, there would be no merch aside from the music itself, and there would be absolutely no slam dancing in the pit. It was that almost cult-like moralization of DIY ethos that made them so iconic, and it helped to make their music as amazing as it was as well. With Repeater, their first album, we see the band at some of their most gritty and energetic, with instrumentals and song structures that, while perhaps more rudimentary than their later works would showcase, are packed to the brim with high-octane power and pure, unfettered punk choppiness. The sound of this record is practically the definition of angular, with not a single rounded edge to be found, and some of the most cutting commentary, both musical and social, that you could find at the time. The instrumentation on here remains some of the most inspired and creative I've ever heard, with some of these bass lines and guitar melodies being so ingenious that I struggle to even conceptualize where they might have been coming from when they wrote them. The band had influences, obviously, and bands like the ones I mentioned before, as well as the likes of Big Black and Sonic Youth, are clear examples of this, but some of the sounds on here feel like they come completely out of nowhere, and it gives the whole album this feeling of being on edge, waiting to see what they do next. Ian MacKaye here is at the absolute top of his game, and unlike with his previous band Minor Threat, he's not the only voice to pay close attention to. Guitarist Guy Picciotto and bassist Joe Lally both lend a substantial amount of their voices to this project, and that, combined with the way their instrumentals all play off of each other in these detailed and arranged ways, makes the band feel more like a communal effort. Rather than everyone staying in their own lanes and just straightforwardly making and playing songs, there's a sense of constant interplay and communication between everyone involved, and it makes for much more engaging compositions than it otherwise would. This more open and meticulous approach to songwriting also allows the band to build a much more palpable sense of atmosphere. From the opening fades into the bass groove on Turnover, all the way to the dirgy harmonic melodies on Shut the Door, the record maintains an excellent balance between sparse and jagged angles and more melodic or vibey passages. The most clear-cut example of this is, naturally, the title track, which, for the most part, is this fast-paced noise rock full of feedback, a rushed bass line, and super busy drum pattern. But when the chorus comes, it somehow has one of the sweetest guitar melodies I've ever heard before cutting right back to the absolute chaos. That's all without mentioning the back half of the song, which blends the two angles even more, with quiet guitar pull-offs underpinning a groovy bass line that is constantly interrupted by massive drum hits and power chords that pierce right through and make every other sound in the mix feel tiny by comparison. And then there's the songwriting itself, which contains some of the most unflinchingly catchy moments in all of punk history. The aforementioned repeater chorus is stuck in my head constantly, as well as the from Merchandise. Styrofoam has the iconic "We're all bigots filled with hatred" refrain, and of course, the closing "Shut the Door" has the striking and unforgettable delivery of "She's Not Breathing." The delivery across the whole album and across all the vocalists is consistently intense and ceaselessly entertaining, and is yet another element keeping this machine oiled to perfection and making this one of the best punk albums of all time. The very first time I heard this record, more than 5 years ago now, my first comparison was that I could tell that the My Chemical Romance debut album was influenced by it. It's something that I found incredibly silly in retrospect for a long time, but nowadays I feel like, why not? It's a testament to the band's legacy that even with as narrow of a taste as I had back then, one that barely scratched the surface of punk, I could still immediately see its ripple effects in bands I enjoyed. Listening to just about any kind of punk or post-hardcore in 2024, it's hard not to at least see hints of Fugazi. They were just that influential and important. And while there are a couple albums in their discography I prefer to the debut, namely Red Machine and The Argument, Repeater is still one of the greatest and most important records in rock music history. Keeping on the topic of punk for one more album before we get to the titular attractions of this episode, Cardiacs is one of those bands that the more I think about them, the more my head hurts. Not because of any negative quality they possess or anything like that, but rather because they are so good at what they do, and what they do is so hard to explain that it makes me existential even thinking about trying to review their music for this series. To make matters worse, the album included in this chart is Sing to God, their second to last album and by far their longest, a double album clocking in at nearly 90 minutes long. Fronted by guitarist and vocalist Tim Smith, the lead visionary behind the project, his brother Jim, who would act as the bassist, and a rotating cast of dozens of other members across their 30-year-long career, Cardiacs seemingly had one mission, which was to create the most theatrical, complex, and indefinable punk music that ever was. This indefinability is what made this such an intimidating prospect, because to write about it, I can either skim over and give bullet points, or I can dive into all the individual tracks and explain what they're doing and why it's so interesting. I'm going to opt to do a little bit of both, with the understanding that this will definitely be the messiest part of the video. That's only appropriate considering the album we're talking about, though, isn't it? So, by 1996, Cardiacs were already almost 20 years into their career together, and this album was the first featuring their somewhat short-lived Mark II lineup, featuring the Two Smiths, new drummer Bob Leaf, and John Poole on guitar and keyboards, who had joined a couple years prior. These are the four somewhat horrifying faces on the cover, and alongside a host of collaborators who helped bring this massive project to fruition, they managed to craft this intricate masterpiece, their magnum opus of punk, prog rock, psychedelic pop, and so much more. This album is a sensory overload in musical form. It's like how Ween makes songs in dozens and dozens of different genres, except in this case, Cardiacs are trying, and on this record completely succeeding, to combine all of those genres together at once on every song. The biggest comparison I can draw is to the 80s Zolo scene with artists like Fred Frith and bands like Oingo Boingo, who made their impact through being as zany and flamboyant as they could be within the genre constraints of new wave. Cardiacs don't have those same restraints though, and so rather than clown bops, we get these massive and epic clown bangers with enormous symphonic rock and dense avant-garde prog compositions from front to back. It's the kind of thing that won't work for a lot of people. It certainly didn't work for critics at the time, but for me and many others, it culminates in some of the most bafflingly incredible music out there. Manic is the only way to adequately describe Tim Smith's vocals on this record, with an overly dramatic flair and a constant need to show off the outer techniques of his vocal range in both directions. a need that is facilitated by the busy and complex compositions that repeatedly change keys, giving him an often constant sense of rising and falling. And there's an infectious confidence in how he glides between these keys and registers that makes every track feel utterly triumphant because he just keeps pulling it off. Combined with backing vocals and a nearly orchestral amount of instrumentation, each track has all the weight and stakes of the score to a medieval battle in a movie, simultaneously elevated and undercut by just how ridiculous the prospect of it is. There is a level of compositional skill behind each of these songs that is hard to overrate. The kind of thing that only a true virtuoso could come up with and write, and the kind of thing only a group of virtuoso musicians could adequately perform to live up to the composition. In that sense, Sing to God is something of a stars-aligning moment, where everything just works from front to back, and it's one of the rare cases where ambitions are up to the moon, and yet somehow the resulting execution is even more impressive. At the end of the day, though, this is still a punk record, which is maybe the most impressive fact of all. Punk is a genre whose social ambitions have always been far greater than its musical ones, and the genre as a whole was born out of a rebellion against the overly virtuosic pretension of prog rock in the 70s, which is why the fact that this massive 90-minute prog album, still maintaining a punk ethos from front to back, is so amazing, and why this record manages to be so captivating in the ways it subverts the expectations of every genre it touches. Cardiacs are a band that will not be for everybody, but regardless of your own personal tastes, you have to be able to appreciate just how obvious of a talent Tim Smith and company were able to put on display here. Tim passed away in 2020, and while his legacy in the band is rock solid, he still becomes another name in the long list of genius musicians who never got the attention they deserved. Sing to God is a once-in-a-lifetime masterpiece that you owe it to yourself to at least witness once in your life. And now we begin the main attraction, the namesake of this video and the only theme I could reasonably connect out of all of these albums, and that's the abundance of slowcore on this row. We start with what was for a long time the most famous band in the genre, Red House Painters, with their debut record, Down Colorful Hill. Fronted by Mark Kozelek, also of Sun Kil Moon fame, the band were an early pioneer of the more lush and detailed variety of slowcore, as opposed to the cold and desolate sound that was pioneered by another band we'll talk about later. That more lush and pretty aesthetic doesn't detract from any of the loneliness and sadness that is a staple of slowcore. As a matter of fact, it is perhaps the quintessential sad people music, with an album cover that pretty cleanly places it in the upper echelons of music to do yourself into. The instrumentation on this thing is so gorgeous that in most other contexts, it would almost be life-affirming. Where the Fugazi record I talked about earlier is the peak of angular and jagged music, this album feels so round and pillowy thanks in large part to the warm and beautiful production and mixing. The bass, especially on a track like Medicine Bottle, lends this great dynamism to the shimmering acoustic guitars, and Kozelek's vocals are mic'd so intimately and his range is so dynamic, it rounds the whole thing out and gives it this really connected but no less isolated feeling. It's perfectly suited to its album cover, feeling like the soft bed that is cozy, but no comfort against the black and oppressive walls of isolation. Which brings us to the lyrics, which are when we get to the really depressing stuff, and also some of the really excellent poetry. This is not a particularly mature record. In fact, if it sounded different, it wouldn't be too out of place in the emo scene, but that doesn't make its words any less evocative. The opening track, 24, is a good example. It's a song about aging from the perspective of someone who is literally not mature, someone who is only freshly out of their teens and who is barely even older than yours truly. Nonetheless, fear of aging persists no matter whether it's fair or correct for you to feel it. I thought at 15 I'd have it down by 16 is an inherently immature line, but that doesn't make it hurt any less. I think to some degree we've all felt this kind of disappointment looking back and thinking, man, I really thought I'd figure it out by now. Immaturity is relatable, often more so than maturity. The record comes back around often to the theme of someone moving to Japan, reminiscent of the movie Lost in Translation, and it comes with all of the same strengths and weaknesses that film does. On the one hand, being in a country or area where you are the only one who doesn't speak the native language can be an incredibly isolating experience, which is pretty much the core conceit of both the film and the song. But on the other hand, using real-life cultures and people as little more than a prop to en masse exemplify a point doesn't sit well with me and leads once again to that degree of immaturity I mentioned before, in this case in a way that I feel detracts from the greatness of the music. And now that we're on the topic of things that detract from this album, we have to address the elephant in the room, one I have not been looking forward to and one that has made it hard for me to praise this excellent album up to this point, and that's the man singing these words. Mark Kozelek is, and I have to say allegedly here, but it is pretty clear-cut, a known sex pest. It's something that initially didn't harm my enjoyment of this album and the Red House Painters' music much in general. After all, Kozelek's input isn't the only one that matters on this record, and in a lot of cases isn't even my favorite element to begin with. And the allegations were all from 2 decades later, so I could pretty comfortably disconnect the two eras as separate. Then, more allegations started to come out. And more of them came out, and as more came out, I started to get less and less comfortable listening to this album casually. More allegations started popping up, and they were getting older too, closer to the time when this album's lyrics were written, and with one scathing and very credible allegation dating all the way back to 1992, the year this album was released, it became very difficult to look at this album, or any of his works, in the eye. Lyrics that were once relatable about self-loathing and isolation, once comforting calls for help, suddenly felt like the pathetic moans of some asshole who couldn't get his way. It was heartbreaking. As of late, I've been more able to listen to some of Kozelek's work than I was at the time of the allegations breaking. 2014's Benji remains one of my favorite depictions of death in music, and the Sun Kill Moon debut is undeniable, but I still appreciate most of his work from a distance. I do not and will not pay for any of his music in any capacity, and I encourage the same from my audience. Down Colorful Hill is a great album, perhaps even a masterpiece, but it's not an album I want to listen to often, and I hope you can understand that. Now that we're thankfully past that loaded topic, let's talk about one of the other pioneers of slowcore, right alongside the likes of Galaxy 500 and American Music Club, and that's Codeine with their first LP, Frigid Stars. For a record so seminal to the genre, one that blazed so many trails in the scene, I'm always impressed by just how much they got right on the first go-around. Long, gloomy, and atmospheric dirges lace this whole record, and while no tracks ever actually go beyond the typical 5 minutes or less runtime in the way you might anticipate, given the trappings of the genre today, their languid pacings and drawn-out tempos still spit in the face of the increasing speed and volume that rock music was beginning to move towards in the years leading up to the grunge explosion. Frigid Stars feels almost less like an evolution of anything happening in rock music at the time, and more like a melancholic answer to the very earliest iterations of sludge metal coming out around that time. That might sound like an absurd line to draw, and maybe it is, but it's one that stuck with me for a long time since hearing it, and I just can't do a video talking about them without mentioning it. Take a track like Cave In later on the album. For the most part, it's a quiet and somber, almost glacial piece, at least for the verses, but when the chorus comes in, we're met with these enormous bloated chords that would likely never move at all if not propelled by the absolutely enormous bass prodding it along. Take all of that, as well as the vocals, which, while obviously clean, are still incredibly determined and strong in their delivery, and try to tell me you don't at least see what I'm talking about. Codeine is a band that lives up to their name, numbing and hypnotic. There's a fog that rests over top of this record that only lifts at the absolute peak of its many crescendos, but largely remains stagnant as a haze you peer through to try and make out its various ideas. The album title is apt as well, like looking up into the stars in the middle of a clear winter's night. It feels very meditative, with occasional revelations that break through and leave you with even more to continue to meditate on. Now, I don't know the extent of this album's influence outside of slowcore. I've never seen another band cite them as a source of inspiration or anything like that, but there's a few things I can't help but notice that this record feels ahead of the curve on. Largely, I think this album was predictive of where the nascent genre of post-rock would go. This album came out directly between Talk Talk's Spirit of Eden and Laughingstock, and in a lot of ways is already doing things those albums' children wouldn't do for years following. One of those bands is my beloved Slint, who I mentioned earlier and who I can't help but see in the track Cigarette Machine, with its dissonant post-hardcore leanings that go hard into that loud, soft noise rock dynamic that made Spiderland so special. Even the biggest post-rock bands like Godspeed feel, at least indirectly, inspired by the way that this record handles crescendos, an impressive feat considering the disparity between the average track lengths between those two bands. All comparisons aside, I love Frigid Stars because it cultivates an atmosphere unlike just about any other album I've heard. There's an isolation and coldness inherent to this record that every other slowcore band wishes they could have come up with first, and to this day, this remains, if not my favorite slowcore album, then at least in the upper echelons. It's a record I don't see come up often, so I'm glad I got to talk about it for this video. The second space-themed album in a row, and not even the last one that shows up in this video, is Spiritualized's 1997 album Ladies and Gentlemen, We Are Floating in Space. Essentially the peak of the 90s space rock revival trend that started by frontman Jason Spaceman's previous band Spacemen 3, this is Spiritualized's third album and fairly unanimously agreed upon as their best. Their first two records, especially their debut, Laser Guided Melodies, were both excellent displays of mood and atmosphere, with spacey dream pop run through the lens of a psychedelic trip, but on this album, we see something that is so much more than that, and while it took me a while to come to terms with much of what Ladies and Gentlemen is doing, it now stands as one of the coolest albums I know. Space, as a concept, makes people emotional. How could it not, really? The idea of such a vast emptiness, endless mysteries, and simultaneously nothing and everything in each direction. It's overwhelming to even conceptualize. You know what other concept makes people emotional without fail? Nostalgia. Space and nostalgia are so fundamentally interwoven that I would challenge you to find a single person in the world who doesn't have some kind of core memory they look back on relating to space. Whatever age we are, wherever we are in our lives, we look to the stars and imagine. Ladies and Gentlemen is an album that seeks to capture that infinite nostalgia in a fashion I would never have considered, and that's by going to the buffet of classic rock music, taking a little scoop of every dish, and sending your plate up into a spaceship for aliens to discover. The first song is the most blatant in this regard, and the result is one of the most impactful songs of the 90s. This title track sets the tone and brings it all into motion via a spaced-out, multi-layered ballad with no less than 2 and often upwards of 4 different vocal lines intersecting at any given time. 2 of those voices are a rendition of Elvis Presley's I Can't Help Falling in Love with You, and the result of the combined spoken word and choir deliveries of such ubiquitous lyrics is this profound sense of wonder and losing yourself to the void. In a weird way, I think this is the only song I've found that properly evokes the same feelings for me as David Bowie's Space Oddity. I get the same sense of longing that so few tracks have ever truly captured this way. Not all of it is so sweet and saccharine though, as we soon find out. Come Together breaks through with some dirty psychedelic and borderline shoegazy guitars, ushering us into this groovy psych rock banger with horns, riffs, and a swagger to the vocals that works in stark contrast to the quaint and beautiful delivery of the opener. What keeps this tied in so nicely is the way it calls back to another classic rock song, this time the Beatles song of the same name. More than just a reference in title and refrain though, this song feels like it has the very same essence and feel of the 60s classic, only with a more space-themed aesthetic. With these two tracks, the record masterfully sets the mood of spaced-out nostalgia and rock and roll psychedelia that the remainder of the runtime resides in. And those two moods are pretty much what many of the tracks here pick between. We've got spacey slow jams like Stay With Me and Cool Waves, which show the production value of this record in their magnitude and sonic openness. And then we've got bangers like Electricity and No God Only Religion, which express magnitude in the opposite way, claustrophobically filling the space with massive, noisy instruments that crowd the mix and expand until there's nowhere left to go. These tracks can feel like achieving liftoff and breaking through the atmosphere in a ball of flame. They're so epic. My two favorite tracks here, though, are Broken Heart and Cop Shoot Cop. The former is an honest-to-God contender for the most beautiful song I have ever heard. This simple love song is made so much more bigger than itself by virtue of a massive and cinematic orchestral backing, with violins, Space Odyssey-esque horn lines, and so much more that all builds and builds to such a striking and emotional climax that I can't help but fall in love every time I hear it. The latter, Cop Shoot Cop, is almost the opposite. Not simple at all, and scarcely beautiful as much as it is brooding, this 17-minute epic closes us out with one of the most engaging long songs you could hope for. The vocal delivery here is so infectiously cool and collected, propelled by one of the best-sounding bass lines and rhythm sections of the 90s. All is well and good until the 4-minute mark, where everything explodes into this raging rock tune, which, over the course of the next 6 minutes, devolves into an absolute hellscape of noise and feedback, tied together only by a single brass line, which somehow manages to loop us all the way back around to where we started, that same bass line, those keys, and that same dejected but nonetheless confident delivery. A whole world condensed into a song, and the perfect closer to this record. There's not a lot that does what Ladies and Gentlemen, We Are Floating in Space does, and I think it'd be hard not to at least appreciate what's being done here, because it's of just such a consistent quality from front to back. Not a moment is wasted here, and the production is so top-notch that no matter what format or sound system you hear it on, you're destined to have a great time. Spiritualized would never reach a peak this high again, and that's part of what makes this so special, I think. It's truly a once-in-a-lifetime achievement. Back to Slowcore, which is where we'll spend most of the rest of this video, we've got an album that is extremely near and dear to my heart, and that's Low's I Could Live in Hope. This is a record I found way later in life than I probably should have, because had I discovered this mid-COVID lockdowns, when I was still taking 2 a.m. walks almost every single night, I think it would have completely changed my life the same way albums I've talked about previously in this series have. This is perhaps the ultimate at-night wearing headphones album. I've had amazing experiences with it during the day too, but nothing even comes close to the experience of this album at night, either while on a walk or in bed looking out the window to an empty street. I think a vast majority of the appeal of I Could Live in Hope comes down to its simplicity, which makes it hard to actually write about, but so easy to listen to. The word for this album is cavernous, I think. The sound of this record is so vast and echoing, it ripples and wanders through seemingly infinite open space, sprawling out into oblivion before eventually meeting your ears and continuing on through and past you forever. There are so few elements that make up this sound: a single clean guitar, a slow, plodding bass, the subtlest drum performances ever, and two singers who feel cosmically linked, fated by a greater power to come together in this moment on this album and create. There's an immense spiritual gravity to this album's existence, a palpable divinity to its creation that I've scarcely heard before, and it's kept me completely enraptured for the years I've now known it. In the year and a half since drummer and vocalist Mimi passed away, not an ounce of the emotional rawness of this album has wavered for me. I still can't believe that the angelic voice behind this album's best moments is no longer with us, but in a way, that's given it an even more ghostly and heavenly feeling. Her soft percussion playing us out into the unknown and her voice narrating the whole path. Alan Sparhawk is not to be slept on here either, acting as the more emotionally direct voice in the music, more grounded and relatably human than angelic. His guitar playing is perhaps the most important piece of this whole puzzle, slow and simple and completely drenched in atmosphere. There is nonetheless a palpable creativity in the playing on this album, and while a lot of it has the feeling of being improvised, not a single note is out of place, and the few times the playing builds in relative intensity, it can feel so cataclysmic, like if anything were to happen out of place, all of it would shatter under its own weight, but it never does. There are few albums I love the way I love this one. Songs like Words, Lazy, Drag, and especially the 10-minute midpoint of the record, Lullaby, rank highly amongst my favorite songs ever written, and I cannot imagine a world without this album or this band. As time went on, the group went into more experimental and noisier directions, and there's a lot of that music that I adore, but to me, this is still where Low showed why they were so important, and where they crafted what is, in my opinion, the greatest slowcore album of all time. Historically, vaporwave is a genre I have not done my due diligence to get into, much to the disappointment of many of my friends and followers here. I don't have all that much of an excuse if I'm being honest, I just haven't found myself driven to it the way other genres, even related ones like ambient and plunderphonics, have. A majority of what I have heard I've enjoyed, with a couple of all-timers sprinkled in there, and I do absolutely understand and appreciate the appeal. I just haven't had the time or energy to invest in digging into a genre like this, especially one that is so self- and externally referential. I would almost consider getting into vaporwave as the musical equivalent of getting into wrestling or comic books, where, sure, you can get some enjoyment out of individual albums you hear, but to really get what fans do out of the genre, you need to dig into so much context and experience so many different things for the fuller picture. With all that said, I suppose there's no better place to start than with the biggest and one of the earliest examples of the genre, Floral Shoppe. You've seen this album around, at least in passing. The album cover is one of the most iconic images of the 2010s, with such an undeniable aesthetic and unique textural makeup that it's remained influential on nearly every piece of vaporwave art to this day. That checkerboard floor, the low-res, high-contrast skyline, the Japanese advertisement core text, and that ever-present statue head. Beyond that, though, the music itself has also been unavoidable online for years, with my first exposure to it coming in around 2016 when I first heard about vaporwave. Specifically, it's the second track, Lisa Frank 420/Modern Computing. That opening instrumental line is so inescapable that even if you're not into music the way I assume a vast majority of my audience is, you've probably come across it in YouTube videos, TikToks, or in online gaming chats. It's so iconic, and for good reason. It's just awesome. Floral Shoppe wasn't the first vaporwave album. That honor is pretty hard to exactly pin down, but Oneohtrix Point Never definitely beat Macintosh Plus out by at least a year with Echo Jams, a psychedelic trip of 80s nostalgia that languishes in its aquatic atmosphere, shifting the original meanings of those old songs. What Macintosh Plus, more often known now as Vectroid, did is define the aesthetic that both the visuals and the music would take on for the decade to come. These songs are rudimentary by today's standards, sure, and artists of all kinds would take these ideas and bring them to greater fruition than they are here, but to have laid the groundwork for such a revolutionary artistic movement, one that spans well outside of music itself and into fashion, video games, and everything in between, is nothing short of incredible, and this album deserves its flowers for that. I don't personally find Floral Shoppe to be an incredibly consistent record. It's uneven at points, and even the greatest tracks here have some moments that raise eyebrows, especially in regards to the rhythmic elements, which sometimes fall out of sync in pretty ugly ways. But all of that pales in comparison to the sheer magnitude of the achievement here and the variety of sounds it manages to cram into such a tight and innovative package. I have nothing but respect for this album and Vaporwave as a whole, and maybe someday I'll be able to properly give the genre it defined its due. From here on out, as per the title, it's all slowcore, baby. There is a pretty wide range of sounds across the 3 remaining albums though, and I think with this episode, you'll be pretty much primed with every different sound and style of the genre. So, in a way, this is kind of a let's get you into slowcore video unintentionally. Duster's Stratosphere is up next, and in terms of current popularity and relevance, somehow this seems to be by far the most popular album in this whole video. A vast majority of that comes from the fact that the track Inside Out on this album blew up on TikTok for some reason, which has netted it an absolutely bonkers 200 million listens on Spotify. I'm not sure what exactly caused this blow up, I don't really use TikTok much, but it is certainly a strange phenomenon. On the topic of the music itself though, Stratosphere is an interesting one to talk about at this point in the video because, in a weird way, it is both extremely similar and vastly different from the Low album we talked about a couple minutes ago. Where that record was cavernous and massive with pristine and echoing production, Stratosphere is narrow and claustrophobic with production that essentially embodies the lo-fi slacker aesthetic. The sound is pillowy and muffled, like you're listening to someone singing to you while you're sobbing under the covers of the biggest, comfiest duvet in an afternoon. I think I understand why the kids on TikTok are obsessed with this now. Admittedly, I do find the appeal of this record to be pretty one note, although it does do a lot of things to surprise me as it goes on, which helps it maintain momentum, and that one note happens to be one of the best sounding notes ever, so there's not much to complain about really. I love how big the title track feels like it's getting over its 7-minute runtime, and how that scale is constrained by the hazy lo-fi sound, droning on and sweeping across the listener, perfectly emblematic of the album cover to me. Some tracks toward the back half of the album also surprise by having much larger production values than you anticipate from the beginning of this record, notably the clean and beautiful Queen of Hearts and Reed to Hillsborough, as well as the absolute rager of a rock banger, Earth Moon Transit, which is probably my favorite track here. I love how shoegazy and unrelenting it is for its entire runtime, and considering how reserved the drums have been throughout the record to this point, it's a wonderful letting loose moment. Stratosphere is a record that gets a lot of love right now. In fact, on Rate Your Music, it is the #1 highest rated album in the slowcore genre, and while it's not quite my favorite, I can't deny how incredible it really is as a focused, determined piece of art that knows exactly what it wants to achieve and gets there without a single hiccup. Duster would only release one more album before disbanding for nearly 2 decades, returning with a self-titled album in 2019 and a follow-up in 2022. Neither of these quite capture the same feeling of isolation as Stratosphere, but if you're looking for more excellent music from them, I also want to shout out all of their EPs released in the 90s, especially Transmission Flux and Apex Translake. They're short, simple, and just as near perfect as the album they precede. If there's one thing the slowcore of this episode hasn't been so far, it's overly lyrical. The closest we've gotten is that Red House Painters album, which had some great poetry to it, but was largely outshined by the lush instrumentation and production values. With this next album, Geek the Girl by Lisa Germano, we remedy that with by far the most lyrics-focused album we've talked about yet in this video, as well as by far the darkest and most harrowing. My relationship with this album started a bit over a year ago when I was just talking with my mom. I don't even remember what it was about, and the song Cry Wolf from this album came on her playlist. She didn't recognize it, and neither did I, but I found it to be so beautiful that I immediately added the album to my queue to listen to the next day. The track was slow and atmospheric in the same way I found Low to be, with a chorus effect on the guitar and a wide-open atmosphere that the vocals sat on top of. Rather than floating like the voices of Mimi and Alan, though, Lisa's voice had a much more grounded, almost grungy tone to her whispers, like a more ethereal Courtney Love or Liz Phair. It was enthralling, but the lyrics evaded me on that first listen. It made it even more impactful and shocking then that when I listened to the whole record the next day, I was met with one of the most gut-wrenchingly sad and upsetting albums I've ever heard. One that held me down and wouldn't let me go and had me repeating it again and again to try and come to terms with what I just found. In spite of its rather quaint and forward presentation, Geek the Girl tells a blunt and unrelenting story of sexual violence and abuse from the perspective of a child. There are a lot of ways that this subject can and has been used tactlessly in music, and even more ways I could insensitively portray it as someone who has not been a victim of many of the traumatic topics and events on the album. But I want to do my best to praise this album's artistic merit without glorifying trauma in the way I've seen happen all too often in reviews like this. The album itself clearly does not glorify that trauma. It doesn't wax poetic or dramatize it. Instead, it puts everything on the table in a raw and unedited fashion that reads more like a teenage girl's attempt to come to terms with what's been done to her than actual traditional lyricism. The immaturity that belies all of the writing on this album is part of what makes it so heartbreaking. This is the perspective of someone who isn't emotionally or mentally capable of processing or engaging with the reality of her trauma, and the attempts to do so on this record come across as desperate and dejected, like reading a diary no one was ever supposed to know about. This comes across in the simplicity and repetitiveness of the title track and the childish hope of the closing track, Stars, but where it comes across most vividly is in the 3-track run of Cry Wolf, A Psychopath, and Sexy Little Girl Princess. The former I talked about already, but upon hearing the lyrics, it gains so much context. The threat of manipulation here is so crushing, but it's portrayed in such a nonchalant and natural way that almost makes it harder to stomach. A Psychopath is genuinely one of the most disturbing songs ever recorded, with extremely simple lyrics about a stalker that leaves plenty of sonic and textual room to insert a real-life 911 call of a home invasion. The cries for help underpin horrid instrumental sounds and this intense feeling of dread and submission. The woman on the phone did not survive. There's a conversation to be had about the ethics of including a recording like this, a conversation I don't feel equipped or experienced enough to have, but regardless, it achieves its goals in a way that no other song ever has. And then Sexy Little Girl Princess puts on depressing display the mentalities that keep cycles of abuse and violence like this going, and the almost hopeless nature of this beast with hushed vocals and a driving rhythm that cuts really deep. Lisa Germano is one of the unsung greats of 90s slowcore, and this record is a perfect example of a serious topic being portrayed with taste and compassion while retaining complete artistic control and integrity. The result is a masterpiece and one of the most important albums of the decade, one I can't recommend enough if you can stomach it. Finally, an uplifting album. Giles Corey's Self-Titled is one of the most joyous, heartwarming, and life-affirming albums you'll ever hear, and it's the kind of thing you can show just about anyone and they'll enjoy it. Okay, so jokes aside, this album is a lot. I talked 2 years ago about the Have a Nice Life debut, Death Consciousness, and on this album, Dan Barrett, who is half of that band, takes up the moniker of Giles Corey for one of the most suicidally depressed albums out there. Far darker than anything in the very real genre of depressive suicidal black metal. This album does everything in its power to evoke the feeling of being at your absolute lowest point, where it looks like there's nowhere upwards to go and all you can do is spiral. Death Consciousness was nowhere near a happy album, but rays of hope shone through the murk in a way that is simply not the case here. And it's the kind of thing that makes you wonder how this guy is even still alive, because if I felt the way that you'd have to make an album like this, I very likely would not be. In terms of the music, there's definitely a lot of similarities to Death Consciousness, especially on the opener, and in the way the explosions of instrumentation sound a bit crushed into oblivion, but in general, I think the production value is significantly higher than on that record, which makes sense considering the circumstances of that album's creation, which I talk about in the second Mucore video. This record feels like it actually has a relatively high production budget, much of which is likely an illusion created by the slathering of reverb, but there's a general sonic clarity that makes it feel much more raw and human rather than alien and paranormal. There's much more focus on these long, sprawling acoustic sections backed by presumably synthesized strings, or sometimes just nothing but voice. The vocals and lyrics here are also far more intelligible than on Death Con, although that's not saying much, but it allows a lot of the depression to seep in more efficiently via lyrics like on I'm Going to Do It and Grave Filled with Books. The key track here is pretty unanimously agreed to be No One Is Ever Going to Want Me, which isn't a take I'm going to argue with here because it is otherworldly levels of phenomenal. The way it builds over its 8-minute runtime with an almost gothic country style of plucked strings and some of the most poetically distressing lyrics that culminate in the refrain of It's Like a Birth but in reverse. The track builds and builds until there's clearly nowhere further for it to go, at which point it suddenly explodes with massive blown out horns, bit-crushed acoustic guitars, and the repeated line of I wanna feel like I feel when I'm asleep, over and over into oblivion. This album more than earns its reputation as one of the most gut-churningly depressed and depressing albums ever. And while I said earlier that there's no hope to be found in the record itself, in a weird way, I do find a strange comfort in it. The album makes you wonder how the guy is still alive after making it, but the fact that he is says something about the determination to live in all of human nature. If Giles Corey, having made this album, was able to survive, so can I, and so can you. And there we have it. Another Mucore video down and 12 more albums reviewed. I'm so excited to keep this series going, as next episode has some absolute all-time favorites for me, including probably my #1 favorite album ever at time of recording this. Shout out as usual to all of my patrons. There's a fair few more of you since the Swans video, which has been doing absolutely amazing. It's already in the top 5 most viewed videos on my channel, and it's still growing. I want to shout out Harry and Evan from Modulation. We're still going hard, talking about all the biggest and coolest new releases, so if you want to have help predicting what my album of the year list will look like in December, that's the best way to get a sneak peek at what I'm digging. You can follow me on Instagram, and now, tragically, Twitter, which I'm back on because I realized I just can't afford not to be able to promote everywhere I possibly can. Thanks for watching this long, and look forward to hearing more from me in the future.